Welcome to Wife Cheating Story. I hope you have an enjoyable and relaxing time listening. Let's get started.
It started with a dull cramp just under my ribs. I figured it was gas, maybe the leftover tacos from the night before coming back to haunt me. But within an hour, I was doubled over in my office, sweating through my dress shirt, gripping the edge of my desk like it was the only thing keeping me upright. My assistant, Denise, took one look at me, eyes wide and scared, and called 911 before I could protest. The paramedics arrived just as I sank to the floor, curled around the pain that now stabbed like a blade with every breath. The back of the ambulance was cold, sterile, bright. They asked me questions I could barely answer through clenched teeth. My vitals weren't good, a heart rate up, blood pressure crashing. One of them muttered something about a ruptured appendix. "We need to get him into surgery fast," I heard someone say. That's when I reached for my phone. Through the haze, I dialed Talia, my wife, my partner, my person. She picked up on the third ring, the noise in the background immediately giving away her location, glasses clinking, laughter, a familiar song from one of her wedding playlists. "Hello," she said, her voice light, almost annoyed. "Talia," I managed. "I'm in an ambulance. They think it's my appendix. I'm on the way to surgery." There was a pause, not a gasp, not a scramble to ask which hospital. Just a pause. Then she said, "I'm at Cassie's wedding." Another pause, then a sigh. "Can we talk later?" I waited, thinking maybe I'd misheard her, that she'd follow it with a frantic, "Where are you?" "I'm coming now." But there was nothing, just the soft hum of her breathing and the echo of a party on the other end of the line. Then a click. The call ended. I looked at the phone like it might explain what had just happened. Like maybe I'd called the wrong number, or maybe she hadn't heard me right. But no. She hung up. She hung up. I was wheeled into the ER, my phone slipping from my fingers. A nurse took it, tucked it into a plastic bag with my wallet and keys. "We're going to take good care of you," she said. Her kindness felt like a warm towel over my chest. Not because it was extraordinary, just because it wasn't indifference. The pain got worse, like someone was twisting me from the inside. They gave me something in and for that blurred the edges of everything. A surgeon came by, explained the risks, said they had to go in immediately. "You'll be under before you know it." I asked if I could see my wife. They shook their heads gently. "No one's here yet." I nodded, not because I accepted it, but because I couldn't argue. I was too tired, too drugged, too hollowed out by the growing realization that she wasn't coming. The last thing I saw before the lights dimmed was the nurse squeezing my hand and telling me to count backwards from 10. I tried, made it to 7, maybe 6. And when I woke up, alone in the recovery room, it wasn't the pain in my side that tore at me the most, it was the silence. The absence of footsteps rushing in. No soft voice saying my name. No fingers brushing the hair from my forehead. Just the beep of a heart monitor, and the sterile ceiling tiles that looked exactly the same as they had when I went under. A nurse came in, smiled warmly. "Surgery went well. We got it in time. You're very lucky." I nodded again. I was alive. Apparently that counted for something. "Anyone coming to visit?" she asked gently. "My daughter, maybe," I said. "She's only 7. The word stuck in my throat. I couldn't say wife. Not right then. Not yet. They moved me to a regular room. I stared at the door every time I heard footsteps in the hallway, expecting her to appear. Expecting anything. Even a text. But my phone stayed dark. And when I finally asked to see it, there was only one new message from my neighbor Clarice. "Bria's with me. Heard what happened. I'll bring her after school. Hang in there." I lay back on the stiff hospital bed, one hand pressed against the bandage on my side, the other gripping the phone like it was a lifeline. But the only one reaching for me was a child. My child. The one with tiny hands and a bigger heart than either of her parents deserved. The morphine dulled the ache in my gut, but nothing could numb the sting in my chest. I kept replaying the moment in the ambulance. Her voice, so breezy, so detached. Like I'd interrupted a grocery list. Like I wasn't lying in the back of a speeding emergency vehicle, minutes away from being sliced open. She didn't ask if I was okay. She didn't even ask which hospital. And maybe that told me everything I hadn't wanted to admit for months now. Maybe the surgery hadn't just removed a failing organ. It had revealed a failing marriage. One that had been rupturing long before my appendix did. The truth hit hard. I could have died, and she wouldn't have known until the music stopped and the lights came back on at that damn wedding. And worst of all, I believed her when she said, "Can we talk later?" Because somewhere deep inside, I was still holding space for a woman who had already let go of me. But not Bria. Bria was coming. And somehow, that was enough to keep breathing. The room was gray, and not just in color. It was the kind of gray that soaked into your skin, numbed your thoughts, and blurred the sense of time. The post-op haze clung to me like a damp towel. Somewhere nearby, monitors beeped steadily, rhythmic, and different. My throat burned from the breathing tube they'd used during surgery, and every inch of my body felt foreign, like it had been taken apart and sewn back together. I blinked slowly, piecing the world together one sterile surface at a time. Then I felt it, small fingers wrapped around my hand. I turned my head, sluggish and heavy, and saw her. Bria, my daughter. 7 years old and already so much more than I deserved. She sat perched on the edge of the hospital bed like she belonged there. Her legs swung gently, brushing against the railing with each motion. Her dark curls were pulled into a messy ponytail, and she wore her favorite rainbow hoodie, the one with the unicorn patch peeling off at the corner. She didn't say anything at first, just held my hand like she'd been doing it the entire time. "Hi, Daddy," she said softly. The sound of her voice hit me harder than the anesthesia ever could. "Bria," I whispered, my throat hoarse. "You're here." She nodded. "Clarice picked me up from school. She said you got hurt." Clarice. My neighbor. The woman who had always offered to help with Bria whenever Talia got too busy. I owed her 100 thank yous. 1,000. Because when I was laid out, sliced open and sedated, it wasn't my wife who showed up. It was my daughter. Delivered by someone who actually gave a damn. "I'm okay," I lied, squeezing Bria's hand weakly. "Just a little sore." She looked at me like she didn't believe a word of it, but she didn't challenge me. "Not yet. I brought Henry," she said, lifting her small backpack onto the bed. She reached inside and pulled out a faded green stuffed turtle, his seams loose, one eye missing. "He keeps secrets," she added, placing Henry gently beside my arm. I chuckled despite the pain that shot through my abdomen. "Thanks, sweetheart. I think I could use a few secrets." Bria swung her legs a bit faster, her eyes studying me with a mix of curiosity and worry that no 7-year-old should ever have to carry. She leaned in close, lowering her voice like we were the only two people in the world. "Why didn't Mommy come?" The question hit harder than the scalpel had. I hesitated. What do you say to a child when the truth would bruise something tender inside her? When the person she trusted most had chosen glitter and champagne over a hospital gurney? "She was at a wedding," I said slowly, measuring every syllable. I think she didn't realize how serious it was. Bria didn't nod, didn't blink. She just stared at me with those wide eyes that had always felt like little mirrors. Then, in a tone that was oddly calm for someone her age, she said, "That's not okay." I didn't know what to say to that. I wanted to defend Talia, to make excuses, but I couldn't find any that made sense, not to her, not to me. Bria reached out and placed her hand over mine again. "I'll stay," she whispered. And she did. For hours, she stayed perched beside me, humming to herself, coloring in her notebook, occasionally checking my monitor as if the beeping meant something she could fix. The nurses adored her. One brought her an extra pudding cup. Another let her borrow a stethoscope. Clarice eventually returned with snacks and a warm blanket for Bria, and I could see the worry etched into her face when she looked at me. "She's strong," Clarice whispered when Bria stepped out to use the restroom. "She wouldn't leave you if you asked her to." I nodded slowly. "I know." As the afternoon faded into evening, I drifted in and out of sleep, lulled by morphine and Bria's soft, constant presence. She didn't cry. Not once. She just existed beside me like an anchor. When the world felt unsteady, she kept it from tilting too far. At one point, I woke to find her asleep at the foot of the bed, Henry tucked under her chin, her notebook clutched to her chest. I reached for it gently, flipping through the pages. There were drawings, bright, bold strokes of color. One of the pictures was of a hospital bed, a little girl sitting beside it, holding the hand of a man with a tube in his side. Underneath it, she'd written, "This is how I helped." I closed the notebook slowly, a lump forming in my throat. She had helped. More than she would ever understand. The door opened quietly a little while later. A nurse stepped in, checked my vitals, and smiled down at Bria. "She's been amazing," she whispered. "Most kids get scared in hospitals. She's been like a little guardian." I nodded again, words still caught in my throat. That night, after Clarice convinced Bria to go home and get some rest, The room felt cavernous without her. The silence was louder, emptier. Talia still hadn't called. Still hadn't texted. I was alone again, in every sense that mattered. I stared at the ceiling, fingers twitching where Bria had held them for so long. The painkillers dulled the physical ache, but the emotional one simmered just beneath the surface, like embers waiting to ignite. I didn't cry. I wanted to, but something about the way Bria had sat beside me, unflinching and faithful, made me hold it together just a little longer. Because she hadn't fallen apart, and if my daughter could sit in this cold, sterile room without breaking, so could I. Before I fell asleep, I whispered into the quiet, hoping the walls would keep the secret too. Thank you, Bria. Thank you for showing up. She was just 7, but in that moment, she was everything. I woke to the sound of stilettos tapping down the hall. There was a rhythm to it, too deliberate to be a nurse. The door creaked open, and in walked Talia, still dressed like the party hadn't ended. Her curls were intact, cascading down her shoulders in ringlets too perfect for morning. Makeup clung to her face, lipstick slightly faded but visible, foundation layered like armor. She wore the lavender dress I'd seen hanging in our closet for weeks, the one she said she wasn't even sure she wanted to wear. Apparently, she did. Hey, she said softly, walking toward the bed like it was unfamiliar territory. You look better than I thought. I blinked up at her, too drained to measure the weight of her words. My throat was dry, and the ache in my side pulsed with each breath. I tried to sit up straighter, wincing at the pain. No, don't, she said, reaching out halfway like she might help, then stopping short. Her hand hovered for a second, then fell to her side. Sorry I couldn't be here last night. Cassie's wedding ran long. Long. That was how she described it. As if time was the only reason she didn't show. Not choice. Not detachment. Just a schedule that got away from her. I looked at her and saw a stranger wrapped in silk and sprayed in rose perfume. A woman who kissed my cheek with lips that didn't linger, like her presence alone was the gift. She pulled back quickly, brushing non-existent lint from her purse. How are you feeling? She asked, not meeting my eyes. I had a drain tube in me last night, I said flatly. Still do. She nodded like I'd told her the weather. Well, I'm here now. She glanced around the room, mildly annoyed by the clutter of used tissues, empty water cups, and the faint antiseptic scent that clung to everything. Room's kind of depressing, she added. It was a hospital. It wasn't meant to be a honeymoon suite. I didn't respond. I just watched her as she finally sat down, crossing her legs at the knee, her dress riding up slightly but never losing its poise. Her phone chimed. She smiled as she pulled it from her purse. Cassie and Trey landed in Cabo, she said, scrolling. Oh, actually, they ran into an issue at the resort. Had to upgrade last minute. $2,000 more than expected. Can you believe that? I stared at her, blinking slowly. She looked up, as if my silence was an invitation. I know we already gave them the espresso machine, but do you think we could help? Just to get them settled, you know? I didn't even realize I was gripping the bed rail until my knuckles turned white. $2,000, I repeated, the words flat and hollow. You're asking me to pay for someone else's honeymoon, from a hospital bed. She tilted her head slightly, like she was confused why I would find this offensive. It's not a big deal. You've helped them before. And it's not like we're strapped. We? Talia, I was in emergency surgery last night. Alone. No one came. Not you. Not anyone. I could have died on that table, and the first time you'd know would have been if they called you after. She didn't flinch. She just pressed her lips together and looked away for a second. You always do this, she said, her voice laced with a defensive edge. Make everything about how I disappoint you. I was at a wedding. I didn't know it was that serious. You didn't ask. That stopped her. Not because it wasn't true, but because it was. She looked at her phone again, more to avoid my eyes than to check anything urgent. A long pause stretched between us, the kind of silence that grew heavier the longer it sat. Then, without shame, she said, well, can we talk about Cassie's thing later? They're stressed, and I don't want to leave them hanging. I let out a laugh that wasn't really a laugh. It was breath and disbelief. I haven't eaten solid food. I have stitches in my side. And you want me to wire money to Cabo? It's not about the money, she snapped. It's about being there for people you love. There it was. The line she didn't realize should have shattered her argument instead of strengthening it. I stared at her, long and hard. I was here last night, Talia. Cut open. Bleeding. Drugged out of my mind. And you didn't come. So maybe don't lecture me on being there for the people you love. The words landed. I saw them hit her. Saw the slight twitch of her mouth. the narrowing of her eyes. But she didn't apologize. She didn't even look ashamed. Just inconvenienced. She stood up abruptly, smoothing out the front of her dress. "I'll come back later. Maybe bring you some real food if they let you eat." And then she walked out. Just like that. Like it was any other visit. Like she hadn't just confirmed every quiet suspicion I'd been trying to suppress for the past year. I stared at the closed door for a long time, the beeping of the monitor returning as the only sound in the room. It wasn't the pain in my body that had hollowed me out. It was the truth echoing in her footsteps as she walked away. She was gone before Bria arrived again, this time with a coloring book and a chocolate milk. She climbed into the chair next to me, giving Henry the turtle a quick pat on the head before settling in. "Mommy said she had to help Cassie," she murmured, like she already knew it wouldn't sit well with me. I nodded slowly. "That's what she said." Bria looked at me for a long time. Then she reached into her backpack, pulling out her drawing notebook. She flipped to a blank page and began to write. "What are you doing?" I asked. She didn't look up. "I'm writing Mom a letter." I didn't ask what it would say. I was too tired, too raw. And somewhere deep inside, I knew Bria would say everything I couldn't. The only thing I could do was reach for her hand and hold it tight. Because the only person who showed up without being asked was a little girl with a turtle and a voice bigger than the both of us. And right then, that was more than enough. The hours slipped past like syrup, slow, sticky, and impossible to ignore. I stayed mostly quiet that day, half awake and sore, the kind of sore that wasn't just from surgery but from something deeper, more permanent. My body was trying to heal, but my mind had already decided what it wouldn't forget. Talia sat in the corner of the hospital room, not beside me, not near the bed, but tucked into the vinyl armchair like a bored guest at someone else's event. Her legs were crossed, her phone cradled in both hands, her thumbs dancing across the screen. She hadn't asked how I slept. She hadn't asked if I needed anything. She hadn't even looked at the drain bag hanging from my side, half full of something that looked like watered-down cranberry juice. Instead, she was smiling at photos. "Look at this one," she said out loud to herself. "Cassie's dress in that light, gorgeous." She turned the phone toward me briefly, but I didn't react, didn't lift my head, didn't offer a sound. The disconnect between her joy and my reality was so vast, it wasn't even worth naming anymore. Bria sat by my side again, her presence a balm. She brought her sketchbook, the thick, spiral-bound one she insisted on carrying everywhere. Crayon bits were smudged along the cover, and the corners were dog-eared from love, not neglect. She wasn't coloring today, though. She was quiet, observant, watching the space around her like she was trying to figure out where she fit in the strange adult world of beeping machines, distant parents, and whispered tension. "Daddy," she said softly, nudging my arm. "Can I see your chart?" I looked down at her, confused. "Why?" She shrugged like the question didn't really need an answer. "I just want to know what happened." I didn't ask further. I didn't need to. Bria had always been a little different, intuitive, thoughtful beyond her age. The kind of child who could sense mood changes before the temperature in the room shifted. I motioned to the clipboard resting in the wall bracket. "You can take it. Just be careful." She climbed off the chair, her little sneakers padding softly on the tile. Talia didn't even look up from her phone as Bria retrieved the discharge note tucked behind the daily chart. She studied it like it was a treasure map, her brow furrowed. Then, wordlessly, she slipped it into the back pocket of her sketchbook and zipped it shut. "What are you planning?" I asked, more amused than alarmed. She glanced at me with a small smile. "I'm not sure yet, but I think Mom needs to read it." I should have stopped her. I should have said something. But I didn't. Because for the first time in 2 days, I felt seen, felt like someone in that room understood what had happened to me. It wasn't just my appendix that ruptured. Something else did too. Something between me and the woman scrolling through Santorini spa packages 5 feet A. Later that night, the room quieted. The nurses made their rounds. The lights dimmed to a gentle yellow that buzzed softly in the corners. Talia was still in the chair, her eyes now scanning Instagram reels, laughing quietly to herself every now and then. I wasn't sure what hurt more, her distance or her ease. Bria sat cross-legged on the floor with her sketchbook open again. But she wasn't drawing. She was writing. Her glitter pen moved slowly, deliberately. The tip scraped softly against the thick paper, her tongue poking out between her lips in concentration. She flipped back and forth a few times, then settled on a clean page. I watched, curious but too tired to ask. When she finished, she carefully folded the page in half, then again, and tucked the paper, along with the discharge note, into a blank white envelope she'd pulled from her backpack. "Where did you get that?" I asked. "Clarice," she said. "I told her I wanted to write a letter." I nodded slowly, swallowing past the dry lump in my throat. "Did you write it for me?" She shook her head. "For Mom." That answer landed like a stone skipping across still water. I didn't know what Bria had written, and I didn't ask. Some part of me trusted her to say what I couldn't, what I'd long stopped trying to. She closed the envelope carefully and looked at me, her eyes clear. "Can I leave it on her pillow when we get home?" I hesitated, then nodded. "Yes," I said. "She needs to know." Bria crawled up into the chair beside me and leaned her head on my shoulder. I winced slightly at the pressure, but didn't move. I couldn't. I didn't want to. "Do you think she'll be mad?" she asked after a while. I looked across the room at Talia, still glued to her screen, still lost in a world I no longer lived in, and then down at the envelope in Bria's lap. "She might be," I said honestly. "But sometimes people need to hear the truth, even when it's uncomfortable." Bria nodded slowly, as if she already knew that, as if she'd known it far longer than a 7-year-old should. The nurse came in a bit later, checking my '4 and updating the chart. Bria yawned and rested her head against the side of the bed. I reached over and brushed a curl from her forehead. "Go to sleep, baby," I whispered. She nodded, clutching Henry the turtle to her chest. Across the room, Talia looked up just once. She saw us, me and Bria, huddled in silence, and for a brief second, her face twisted into something unreadable. But she didn't say anything. She didn't ask about the envelope Bria now held under her palm. She just returned to her scrolling, pausing only to like a photo of Cassie and Trey toasting in the glow of a candlelit dinner. That night, the monitors kept beeping. My side throbbed. But none of it hurt as much as knowing the most important moment of the day didn't even register for my wife. My daughter wrote a letter. And I hoped it would be loud enough to be heard over 1,000 missed moments. We returned home 3 days later, though the word home no longer felt accurate. It was just a structure now, walls and beams and hollow spaces where intimacy used to live. I walked slower than usual, hunched forward like a question mark, my body still learning how to move without screaming. The incision in my side burned with each step, every breath stretching the line of stitches, but I said nothing. What was the point? Talia barely spoke during the drive. Her fingers tapped constantly against her phone screen, the soft clicks syncing with the car's turn signals like a metronome for her apathy. She didn't ask if I was hungry. Didn't ask if I needed help into the house. When we pulled into the driveway, she simply got out, heels clacking against the pavement as she carried her purse and went inside ahead of me. Bria stayed close, one hand on my elbow, her tiny frame acting like a pillar I shouldn't have needed but did. Inside, the air smelled like lemon cleaner and silence. Talia had arranged for a cleaner to freshen up the place before we came home. She said it was so I wouldn't have to worry about mess when I returned. But it didn't feel like a gesture of care. It felt like staging. Like the house had been prepped for appearances, not recovery. I sank slowly into the couch, biting my lip against the ache as I eased down. Bria ran to get my blanket, the one with the navy and gold checkers she always insisted made me look like a superhero. She draped it over my legs, and then scampered off to the kitchen without a word. The sound of drawers opening and the soft scrape of a chair being dragged caught my attention. I turned my head slowly and saw her at the kitchen table, glitter pen in hand, notebook open again. She sat with a quiet focus, her tongue tucked at the corner of her mouth, just like she did when she was trying to get her unicorn drawing symmetrical. She was writing again. This wasn't the playful kind of writing. No hearts, no stars, no doodles in the margins. Just neat lines and her small hand pressing firmly, like every word had to land with the right amount of weight. She folded the paper, opened a fresh envelope, and slid the note inside. Then she reached into her sketchbook and took out the hospital discharge summary she'd tucked away days earlier. She placed it gently in the envelope behind the letter and sealed it shut. She stared at the envelope for a moment, then stood and walked down the hallway with quiet purpose. I watched her pass, watched her pause just outside our bedroom. She looked back at me once, not for permission, but for reassurance. I gave her a small nod, the only strength I could manage. She turned the doorknob slowly, tiptoed inside, and a few seconds later, she re-emerged empty-handed. Talia came downstairs a moment later, dressed for work. She was already wearing heels, makeup fresh again, phone tucked in her palm like a lifeline. "I've got meetings this morning," she said, not looking at me. "Did you take your meds yet?" "I did," I replied. My voice cracked a little. I hadn't spoken much since we got home. Maybe I didn't trust it to carry all I was holding in. She glanced at me, her eyes skimming the blanket, the way I was sitting slightly lopsided, the swelling around my waist. But she didn't ask how I felt. Not really. Her eyes flicked toward Bria, who was now sitting on the floor with her turtle Henry, brushing its plush head with the care of a child nursing something hurt and precious. Talia walked into the kitchen, heels clicking against the hardwood. "We're low on almond milk," she said, as if that were somehow more urgent than the incision tearing through my side. Then she added, "Remind me to grab a gift for Trey's mom. Her birthday's next week." I didn't reply. I wasn't being petty. I just didn't have the emotional energy to stretch toward someone who never once stepped toward me. 10 minutes later, the front door shut behind her. The silence that followed wasn't peace. It was proof. Proof that everything I'd felt in that hospital room was not imagined. The distance was real. And now that I was home, I could see it even more clearly. Our lives weren't intertwined anymore. They were simply overlapping out of habit. Bria climbed into the chair beside me and rested her head on my shoulder. "She'll find it," she whispered. "She will," I replied, resting my hand on top of hers. "She'll probably be mad," she added, looking up at me. "Maybe. Will she say anything?" "I don't know." That was the truth. I had no idea what Talia would do with the envelope, whether she'd read it at all, whether she'd care. But I did know one thing: someone had to say something. And Bria had done it. At 7 years old, she'd had the courage neither of us did. Later that evening, I heard footsteps upstairs. Then stillness. Long, thick stillness. I imagined her walking into the room, seeing the envelope on her pillow. I imagined her picking it up, maybe recognizing the handwriting, maybe thinking it was a drawing or a note from Bria asking for another trip to the zoo. I wondered what her face looked like when she realized it was something else, something heavier. I didn't go upstairs. I stayed on the couch while the television murmured on low volume. Bria sat beside me, curled up under my arm with Henry squeezed tight against her chest. She didn't ask to watch cartoons. She didn't ask for snacks. She just stayed close. Like I was the patient and she was the caretaker. And maybe that was true. When Talia finally came down, her steps were slower than usual. Her hands were empty. No phone. No purse. She didn't say anything. Just walked past us, paused in the doorway to the kitchen, then turned and went right back upstairs. I didn't follow her. Bria lifted her head. "Do you think she read it?" "I think she did. She didn't say anything." "She doesn't know how to," I said softly. Bria nodded like she understood something deep and painful and adult. "She has to feel it first." And maybe that was the most profound thing I'd heard in weeks. The envelope had been delivered. Now we waited to see if the words inside could do what silence never could. I didn't hear her open the envelope, but I knew the exact moment she found it. The house had fallen into its quiet nighttime rhythm, dishwasher humming low in the kitchen, the distant creak of wood settling into the walls. Bria had already gone to bed, tucked in with Henry under one arm and the corner of her blanket curled in the other. I was in the guest room, not because anyone said I had to be, but because the idea of sleeping beside Talia after everything felt like inviting a stranger into my grief. I lay there in the dim light, staring up at the ceiling, trying not to think too hard, trying not to imagine the crumple of paper or the sharp inhale she might have made when she recognized her daughter's handwriting. But then I heard it, the soft tread of her footsteps down the hall. They stopped just outside our bedroom door. The floorboards groaned, then silence. A long silence. And then a sigh, like something cracked inside her chest. I didn't move. She didn't either. Eventually, the door creaked open and then gently closed. Another few seconds passed before I heard the mattress creak and settle under her weight. Then stillness again. I could picture her. Sitting on the edge of the bed in that pale light, envelope in hand, The doctor's discharge note folded inside with Bria's words scrawled in glitter pen, tiny, unfiltered, and devastating. I'd never read the letter. Still hadn't asked. But I didn't need to. Bria had seen everything. Heard enough. Felt too much. And in her own way, she'd become the witness I didn't know I needed. I sat up slowly, the incision pulling like a stitch caught on fabric. I shuffled to the hallway, leaning against the door frame to catch my breath. The house was dark, but from under the crack in our bedroom door, I saw a line of light, still and faint. Then it happened. The sound of paper rustling, a breath catching in a throat. And then, barely audible, the faintest shiver in the air. I could hear it because I wasn't just listening with my ears. I was listening with everything in me. I knew that sound. Her hands were shaking. For the first time in what felt like forever, the silence wasn't mine, it was hers. The weight of that reversal was nearly enough to drop me to the floor. I didn't knock. I didn't speak. I backed away from the door, back into the guest room, and sat on the edge of the bed, stunned by the reality of it. She was finally seeing it. Not just the paper. Not just Bria's words. She was seeing me. All those nights she rolled away instead of asking how work was. All those dinners where I carried the conversation like luggage only I packed. All the birthdays, anniversaries, long silences dressed up as peace. The overlooked efforts. The forgotten kindnesses. The apologies I'd never been owed, but gave anyway. Now, in that room, with Bria's tiny handwriting spelling out everything I'd left unspoken, Talia was facing the one thing she couldn't ignore: reflection. Not accusation. Not revenge. Reflection. An hour passed before I heard her move again. She padded into the hallway barefoot, more slowly than usual. Her pace was tentative, hesitant. She paused outside the guest room, and I held my breath, unsure if she'd knock or keep walking. The door creaked slightly, and then she pushed it open with a hand that still trembled. Her face was pale, washed out under the hallway light. Her eyes looked softer, but guarded, too. She didn't say my name. Just stood there, the envelope in one hand, the folded note in the other. I read it, she said, her voice small. I nodded. She stepped in slowly, as if the room might collapse beneath her. She wrote it herself. You didn't tell her to, right? No, I said. She looked down at the paper again, her eyes welling, not spilling, but holding something at the edge. She said she saw me smiling at pictures while you were in pain, Talia murmured. She said she was scared, not just for you, but for what it meant that I didn't care. I didn't answer. Not because I couldn't, but because she needed space to say what she hadn't been able to. She said I didn't come when it mattered, she whispered. You didn't. The words hung there like smoke. Heavy, honest. Talia sank down into the chair in the corner, the one where she'd scrolled through wedding photos in the hospital room without so much as a glance at my face. Her fingers gripped the edge of the chair. I didn't think it was that serious, she said again, repeating the excuse like it might sound better the second time. You've always been strong. You always bounce back. I thought. You thought I could do it alone, I finished for her. And I did. But that wasn't the point. She pressed her lips together, then opened them again only to close them once more. Why didn't you say anything? She asked. Why didn't you scream or demand I come? Because I didn't want to ask to matter, I said quietly. I wanted to see if I did. The silence that followed wasn't cold. It was aching. It was the sound of bricks falling out of a wall she didn't realize she'd built. She looked at me, eyes rimmed with red. I'm sorry. I believed that she wanted to mean it. I even believed she meant it in the moment. But I'd learned that apologies weren't always repair. Sometimes they were just punctuation at the end of a long sentence no one had the courage to edit. I nodded, accepting what I could, leaving the rest untouched. She reached into her pocket and pulled out Bria's stuffed turtle. Henry. She left him on my pillow too, she said. Said he keeps secrets. He does, I said. But Bria? She doesn't. Talia managed a weak smile. No, she doesn't. For a long while, neither of us moved. We didn't rehash the hospital, or the wedding, or the way silence had replaced intimacy over time. We just sat in the gravity of a letter written in glitter ink that had said more than a marriage full of dinner conversations ever had. Eventually, Talia stood and walked back toward the door. She turned before she left, one hand resting on the frame. I don't know how to fix this, she admitted. I nodded slowly. I don't either. But in that moment, I knew something had shifted. Not healed. Not reversed. Just shifted. Because her hands had shaken. And that meant, for once, she'd felt it. The next morning arrived with the smell of burnt toast and scrambled silence. The house was unusually still, as if it too had read Bria's letter and didn't know how to respond. I lay in bed listening to the muffled sounds of movement. Talia in the kitchen, fumbling with pans like she wasn't sure what to do with her hands now that they weren't holding her phone. I rose slowly, my body stiff and sore, the incision pulling with each breath. I didn't call out or announce myself. I just moved down the hallway like a ghost revisiting a life he used to live. The kitchen was awash in morning light, too bright for the kind of quiet that filled it. Talia stood over the stove, her robe cinched too tightly, hair pulled back into a bun she used when she didn't want to be seen. She turned when she heard me, but didn't smile. "Scrambled eggs," she said softly. "And toast." I forgot the timer on the first batch. I looked at the pan. The eggs were too dry, the toast still smoking on a plate by the sink. She wasn't here to impress anyone. This wasn't a grand gesture. It was something else, an apology without a name. I nodded, taking a seat at the table. Bria sat across from me, dressed and ready for school, even though we hadn't yet spoken a word about it. Her backpack rested beside her chair, and her shoes were on the wrong feet, something she often did when she was too deep in her thoughts to notice. Talia set a plate in front of me. No garnish. No effort to dress it up. Just food, mechanical and sufficient. "How did you sleep?" she asked, still standing. I took a bite of toast and chewed slowly before answering. "Fine." She nodded, then moved to the counter and began wiping down a perfectly clean surface. "I was thinking of taking Bria to school today. You could rest." Bria looked at me for permission, like I was still the compass she trusted even when the maps got confusing. "That's fine," I said. Talia glanced over. "I mean, unless you'd rather I didn't." I didn't answer right away. "You should take her." Bria stood slowly, slinging her bag over one shoulder. She walked around the table and pressed a kiss to my temple. "Text me later," she whispered. "Always," I replied. She didn't kiss her mother. Just walked to the front door and waited. Talia followed a moment later, pausing with her hand on the knob. She looked back at me like she wanted to say something, like the apology was still somewhere between her throat and her lips. But it didn't come. Not yet. When the door shut behind them, the silence left behind was heavier than their presence had been. I sat at the kitchen table for a long time, staring at the uneaten eggs, the half-burnt toast, and the empty space where words should have been. Around noon, my phone buzzed. I picked it up expecting a message from Bria, maybe a doodle or a thinking of you note in emoji form. But it wasn't her. It was an email from Talia's cousin, Cassie. Subject: "Thank you so much. Hey, just wanted to say thanks again for the honeymoon contribution, Trey, and I were so surprised. We landed in Cabo and upgraded our suite because of you two. You didn't have to, but we're so grateful. Can't wait to show you photos when we get back." The breath I took in was sharp. Cold. There had been no gift. I hadn't authorized anything. I hadn't agreed to send money. Not after what had happened. Not after what she asked for in the hospital, as I lay there with tubes in my side and silence in my ears. I stared at the email for a long time, the words blurring into noise. Then I checked our account. There it was. A $2,000 transfer. Dated the same night I'd returned home. The weight of it sank low in my chest. This wasn't just selfishness. This was an oversight. This was theft of trust, of choice, of the very dignity I'd been trying to rebuild. I set the phone down carefully, like it was something fragile I didn't want to break even though it had just broken me again. Later that afternoon, Talia returned. She stepped inside with her work bag slung over her shoulder and the car keys still in hand. She looked surprised to see me still at the table, like she thought the day would erase the inn. "How was your day?" she asked. "Cassie emailed," I said. She froze mid-step. "She thanked us for the honeymoon contribution," I added. Her eyes dropped to the floor. "I didn't agree to that," I said quietly. "I know," she replied. "No excuses this time. Just the truth in its raw, unadorned form." "I didn't say yes, Talia." "I know," she whispered again, barely audible. "Then why?" She hesitated. "Because they asked. Because I didn't want to say no. Because it felt easier to ask for forgiveness than permission." "You didn't even ask for forgiveness." She finally looked up. Her eyes were red-rimmed again, but this time there were no tears waiting behind them, just exhaustion. "I don't know how to fix what I've done." I nodded. "You don't. But that doesn't mean I'll keep pretending it's not broken." She opened her mouth to respond, but nothing came out. So I stood, every movement deliberate, and walked past her toward the guest room. I didn't slam the door. I didn't yell. I just closed it. That night, I lay in bed with my back to the door, staring at the wall until sleep finally came. And in that stillness, I realized something simple but final. There were no apologies. Not real ones. Only a hollow routine dressed up as love. And I'd finally stopped listening for sorry. A week passed like fog, clinging to everything, softening the edges, but not enough to hide the bruises underneath. I moved slower, not just because of the pain in my side, but because I was still dragging the weight of things unspoken. Talia and I exchanged words, sure, but they were functional, past the salt, as Bria dressed, the car needs gas kinds of words. None of them filled the silence between us. They just camouflaged it. Then came the brunch invite. Talia's Aunt Lydia was hosting one of her infamous family gatherings, complete with champagne flutes, matching linen napkins, and surface-level smiles. Talia said we should go. Everyone will be there, she'd insisted, her tone teetering on obligation and desperation. It'll be good to show up. Show up for who? I asked. She didn't answer. I didn't want to go. The idea of sitting through stories of wedding cakes and honeymoon packages made my chest tighten, but Bria heard us talking. She looked up from her cereal with a quiet kind of hope. Will Grandma be there? She asked. And Aunt Lydia's dog? I nodded slowly. Yeah, baby. They'll be there. Then can we go? Just for a little, she asked, her eyes shining the way they used to when she believed the world was fair and kind. So I said yes. Not for Talia. For Bria. We arrived to a house filled with curated warmth, scented candles, pristine white furniture, and soft jazz humming through invisible speakers. People greeted us at the door with their kisses and tilted glances. Talia's hand brushed mine once in the driveway, like she was testing if I'd be the husband she could parade again. I kept my hands in my pockets. Inside, Lydia welcomed us with the performative joy of a talk show host. Darling, you're glowing. Oh, and look at you, she added to me, her voice dipping into polite surprise. You made it. I'm not dead, I replied, maybe a little too flat. She blinked, then chuckled, brushing it off with a pat on my arm. You always were the dry one. Bria darted toward the backyard, chasing after the corgi with her usual giggle, the sound of it briefly restoring some brightness to the day. We moved to the dining room, where the table was already set, placed cards, polished silverware, miniature name tags tied with ribbon. Talia sat near the center, next to Cassie and her new husband Trey, who looked like he still hadn't unpacked from Cabo. I was placed at the far end, between Lydia's husband and a cousin I hadn't seen in years, someone who once asked me what my name was at our wedding. I eased into the chair carefully, the incision under my shirt reminding me of the wound I still carried. I glanced around the table as the brunch began. Platters passed hands. Stories were swapped. No one mentioned the hospital. No one asked how I was doing. Not a single person looked me in the eye for longer than a second. Cassie beamed as she told the table about the honeymoon. It was magical. The room upgrade was perfect. The champagne, the view. Trey surprised me with a spa day. I felt like a queen. Talia clapped lightly, her voice sweet. You deserved it, Cass. You two worked so hard to make that wedding amazing. I watched the words float between them like currency, exchanged easily, carelessly. And we never got a proper chance to say thank you. Cassie added, turning toward me. That money saved us. You're such a generous guy. I looked at her for a long second, then took a sip of water instead of answering. Someone brought up real estate. Someone else mentioned a new Pilates studio. Lydia went on about her cruise points and how she'd finally earned enough for a free Mediterranean upgrade. Every sentence felt like a plastered-on laugh track from a show I was never invited to join. Bria came back in, her cheeks flushed from running outside. She sat on the arm of my chair instead of returning to her own. She looked around the table, and I watched her eyes dart from face to face like she was memorizing something important. As the table buzzed with wedding photos and vacation plans, my daughter leaned in and whispered, "No one asked if you're okay." "No," I whispered back. They didn't. Talia glanced down the table once, met my eyes for a fraction of a second, then quickly turned back to the conversation. She was laughing. At Trey's joke, maybe. Or pretending to. Bria stayed beside me, picking at a corner of her dress. The room had grown louder, fuller with the laughter of people who didn't know they'd left something bleeding behind them. "Daddy," Bria said softly, her voice barely audible above the clatter of silverware. "Can I say something?" I looked at her. Really looked. Of course. She stood. Right there, at the long table covered in floral centerpieces and mimosa pitchers, she stood. Her chair scraped softly against the floor as every adult head turned toward her. Talia's smile faltered. "Bria," she said, a warning tucked inside her name. But Bria didn't stop. "My dad almost died," she said, her voice clear. Small, but unwavering. He had surgery. Real surgery. And he was alone. Mommy was at the wedding. No one came. A stunned hush fell over the table. "I wrote Mommy a letter." She read it. "But none of you said sorry," she added, holding up the folded discharge paper like it was a flag of truth. "You were busy with cake and dresses." Cassie's mouth parted. Lydia blinked. Trey coughed into his napkin. Talia stared at her daughter as if she didn't recognize her. "I just thought you should know," Bria finished. Then she sat back down beside me, tucking Henry, who had been in her pocket, into her lap like a shield. The silence wasn't awkward. It was seismic. It cracked something open that had been sealed too long. I reached for Bria's hand and squeezed it. She didn't look at me, just sat still, proud and calm. Talia tried to recover, raising her glass in some kind of false transition, but it was too late. The mood had shifted. The performance had ended. The truth had taken center stage. That day, we left before dessert. Talia didn't speak on the way home. Bria fell asleep in the back seat, Henry tucked under her chin. And me? I drove in silence, but inside, I was standing. Finally standing. Because my daughter had said the words that had lived inside me for weeks. And there was no taking them back. We didn't talk much the night after the brunch. The silence wasn't cold, it was calcified. Like something ancient had finally cracked wide open, and no one dared touch the shards just yet. Talia barely looked at me as she paced the kitchen, her footsteps softer than usual, as though she didn't want to rattle anything else loose. Bria had gone straight to her room, a quiet trail of glitter from her hair clip marking her path. She didn't say she was tired. She didn't ask for cartoons. She just climbed into bed, pulled the blanket to her chin, and turned her face toward the wall. I stood outside her door for a moment, unsure if I should knock or just let her rest. In the end, I chose to sit on the floor outside, the weight of the day still pressing into my chest. It wasn't just what she'd said, it was the way she'd said it. Steady, clear, not a tantrum, not an outburst, a declaration. She had spoken for me, yes, but she'd also spoken for herself, because she'd been watching, listening, waiting. The next morning, the house was awkwardly quiet. Talia tiptoed through breakfast, pouring cereal like it was a peace offering. She placed the bowl in front of Bria, who stirred the spoon without eating, eyes fixed on the milk slowly turning beige from the flakes. "I was thinking," Talia said cautiously, "maybe we should have a movie night tonight. Order pizza, just the three of us." Bria didn't respond. I cleared my throat. "Bria?" She looked up at me. "Do we have to pretend again?" Talia froze. Her lips parted slightly. "Pretend what?" Bria's eyes locked on her mother's with the kind of honesty that only comes from children before the world teaches them to dilute truth. That everything's fine. That you didn't forget Daddy in the hospital. That no one at brunch cared. Talia's hand tightened around the cereal box. "That's not fair." "It's not supposed to be," Bria replied. There was no anger in her voice. Just facts. A child's math. And the numbers didn't lie. Talia looked at me then, as if begging for intervention, a bridge, a softened version of the moment. But I didn't step in. I couldn't. Bria slid off the stool and disappeared down the hall again. I waited for the slam of a door, but it never came. "She's a child," Talia said, the edge in her voice growing. "You think that was appropriate? At a family brunch?" "She's a child," I repeated, "who watched her father go into surgery alone and come out to a party you never left. She doesn't understand the full context." "She understands enough," I said. "More than most adults in that room." Talia shook her head and turned her back to me, wiping a perfectly clean counter. "You always take her side." I sighed, my fingers curling into the armrest. "There shouldn't be sides, Talia. That's the problem." She didn't respond, just scrubbed harder, like the silence was something she could wipe away. Later that day, Bria reappeared with her drawing notebook. She sat beside me on the couch and opened to a new page, flipping past sketches of Henry the Turtle and lopsided family portraits. "What are you working on now?" I asked. She looked up, her eyes wide. "I'm writing my speech." I raised a brow. "Speech?" She nodded. "In case I have to say it again." I swallowed hard. "You don't have to do that, sweetheart. You said what needed to be said." "But what if they still don't get it?" she asked, tapping her pen against her notebook. "What if they pretend again?" Her question hit me in a place I'd been avoiding, because pretending was how Talia and I had survived so long. Pretending that distance was routine. That silence meant peace. That forgetting someone in the most vulnerable moment of their life could somehow be brushed over with matching napkins and champagne flutes. They might, I admitted. But that doesn't mean you have to stay quiet. She kept writing. That evening, Talia approached with a stiffness in her spine. She held her phone in one hand and a pair of folded pajamas in the other. I told Mom we won't be coming next weekend, she said, voice flat. I nodded. I said we needed time as a family. Another nod. She set the phone down and looked at me, her eyes searching. Do you want to talk? I think we've done enough talking, I replied. Now it's about listening. To what? To Bria. To yourself. To what this house has become. She lowered herself onto the edge of the armchair across from me, the weight of it finally catching up. I didn't mean to let it get like this. I said nothing. Regret wasn't currency anymore. It couldn't be traded for love. I thought I was doing what I had to keep up appearances, to be the kind of wife, the kind of friend. You stopped being a partner. The sentence cut through the space between us like a blade. And you stopped asking me to be one, she added, quietly. I paused, surprised by the truth in her reply. You gave up on me, she whispered. And I didn't know how to fight for something that didn't want to be held anymore. The room tilted in that moment. Not in rage, not in sorrow. In honesty. Finally. But honesty comes late sometimes. And it doesn't always rebuild what's fallen. From down the hall, we heard Bria humming. A soft, tuneless melody that drifted into the silence like a thread trying to stitch something back together. Talia's voice cracked. Is it too late? I don't know, I said. But if you're asking me that now, it means you finally started to care again. She blinked back the sting in her eyes. I don't know how to fix this. You don't fix it, I told her. You show up. And you stop expecting praise for doing the bare minimum. She looked away, ashamed. Bria came back out moments later, clutching her notebook. Can I read you something? Talia nodded. I did too. She climbed into my lap, opened to a page, and read slowly, her voice clear. When someone you love is hurting, you're supposed to sit with them. Not scroll through parties. Not leave them alone. If you forget someone when they're scared, they won't feel safe around you again, even if you smile later. So I want people to know what hurting sounds like, so they won't do it too. Talia cried then. Not sobbed. Not wailed. But cried. Quietly. The kind of cry that comes from being seen as the villain in a story you didn't realize was being written. Bria closed the notebook, satisfied, and placed Henry in her mother's lap. He keeps secrets, she said. But you shouldn't. And with that, Bria went back to her room. And Talia finally sat still. Really, really still. The thing about healing is that no one tells you how quiet it is. Not peaceful quiet, just still. The kind of still that follows an explosion. The kind that lets you hear your own breath and realize how long you've been holding it. The morning after Bria read her letter aloud, the house didn't bounce back. It didn't buzz with apologies or hum with reconciliation. It just existed in that gray space between damage and decision. Talia was different, yes, but not changed. She moved more softly, spoke more gently, but the air around her still vibrated with discomfort, with guilt. The kind that wants to be forgiven without truly knowing how to ask. I noticed she'd been wearing her wedding ring again. She'd stopped for a while, probably without realizing. It had sat unused in the dish by the sink for weeks. But now it was back, quietly slipped on, like maybe it could speak for her when she couldn't. She made breakfast that morning, blueberry pancakes, Bria's favorite. She asked me if I wanted coffee. I said no. We didn't talk much. We hadn't since Bria's words turned the house into something resembling a courtroom. After Bria left for school, hugging me twice, telling me I looked almost healed, Talia and I stood in the kitchen alone. She leaned against the counter, arms folded, eyes scanning the room like it was a stranger's home. I've been trying, she said, almost in a whisper. I know. She looked at me then. I don't know if it matters now. I nodded. It does. Just not the way you hoped. She swallowed hard. You're not here anymore, are you? My eyes didn't flinch. I'm in the house. But I haven't been home for a long time. The words didn't come with fire. They weren't meant to wound. They were just the truth. I didn't think it would come to this, she murmured, her voice shaky. Neither did I. She reached into the drawer beside her, pulled out a folded paper, and placed it on the counter between us. It was an apology letter. Handwritten. The kind people write when they've been coached on accountability, when they finally understand what harm feels like from the other side. I didn't pick it up. I wrote it, she said, tapping it once. But I think I'm too late. You are, I said, gently. But thank you for writing it anyway. She nodded, her fingers twitching nervously. What now? It wasn't the first time she'd asked that question, but it was the first time she said it without expecting me to carry the answer. I've been looking at places, I said. Nothing far. Just enough to breathe. Her eyes didn't widen. She didn't gasp. I think, somewhere inside, she knew it was coming. Maybe she had known for years and just kept hoping that if we both stayed silent long enough, the story would rewrite itself. For Bria, she asked, voice cracking. For all of us, I said. She needs to see that love isn't supposed to feel like waiting. A tear slipped down her cheek, but she didn't wipe it away. I don't want to lose my family. You lost me the moment I realized you'd rather protect a party than hold my hand in an emergency room, I said. This is just the part where we stop pretending it didn't happen. She reached for the counter, steadying herself like the floor had moved. I never hated you, I added. Even when it hurt. I just kept hoping you'd see me again. But you didn't. And Bria did. That's what saved me. She sat down then, in the kitchen chair that still had a tiny sticker Bria had stuck on months ago, a glittery dolphin that had refused to peel off cleanly. She didn't speak again for several minutes. I'll tell her, I said, about what's happening. And I'll do it kindly. I won't poison her against you. Her shoulders slumped in relief. Thank you. She doesn't need to carry our failure, I added. She just needs to see us handle it with care. The words settled in the room like soft dust, landing on everything. That afternoon, I picked Bria up from school. She came running toward me, backpack bouncing, her smile wide and unburdened. I braced for the questions, she always had them. But instead, she slipped her hand into mine and walked quietly to the car. In the driveway, before climbing in, she looked up at me. You're moving out, aren't you? I froze. Who told you? She smiled sadly. No one. I just know. I heard you say you needed to breathe. I crouched to her level, wincing slightly from the healing stitches, and tucked a curl behind her ear. I love you more than anything. That's not changing. I know, she whispered. I'll be close. You'll see me every day. Weekends. After school. We'll have our routines. She nodded slowly. Can I have 2 bedrooms? One here and one there. You can have 2 homes, I said. And one heart that's always yours. She hugged me so tightly I had to breathe through it. When we got inside, Talia was waiting in the living room. Bria ran to her and hugged her without hesitation. I saw the surprise in Talia's eyes, the way she held her daughter like she was made of glass. I want you both to be happy, Bria said. That night, I began packing a small bag, just the essentials. I wasn't rushing, but I wasn't dragging my feet either. Talia helped in silence. She folded one of my sweatshirts and placed it in the duffel without looking at me. When I reached the door, Bria stopped me. Wait, she said, running to her room. She came back with Henry. He wants to go with you this time. I smiled through the tightness in my chest and took the stuffed turtle, worn and beloved. Thank you, I said. She hugged me again, and this time, I let my tears fall. I didn't hide them. I didn't turn away. Talia stood by the door, arms folded, eyes wet, but no longer filled with panic. Just acceptance. You'll be okay, I said to her. So will she. I hope you find your breath again, she whispered. I already have, I said, stepping out into the quiet. And for the first time in a long, long time, the silence didn't hurt. It healed.